community to say, how are we going to manage these assets? We say, no, that doesn't make sense. It's inefficient. Let's elect people that represent our interests. And and we can hold them accountable through the election process. If they are not listening to us, they're not being responsive to our needs and the issues that we're facing, then we can remove them by voting them out and putting someone else in their place. So there's a built-in responsiveness to that process. So how do we finance these public assets? Taxes, right? So taxes, where we all say, look, somehow we've got to fund this. We've got to fund the public water system and the public sewer system and transportation. So we're going to tax ourselves. We're going to say, we need to collect resources or money that then this group of people we've elected can then use those resources to deliver those services. We collect those taxes. So taxes and fees to meet the common interests. But I don't know if you are, and I don't, because it doesn't make sense for me to try to track what it is I'm paying in. Am I getting exactly back that as a return on my investment? We can't see our taxes as a direct return on investment. It's not like putting money in the stock that should be growing for us. But we're saying that there are things that make sense for me to put into the pool or the pot of money to be managed on our behalf, but I may or may not be realizing the benefit. I have not gone swimming in a public pool in decades. They're gross. That's one of the reasons, but it's just not my interest. And yet I don't have a problem making sure that there is a public pool in my community. There is not in this state a public pool that cash flows. It's averaging right now about $30,000 to backfill from the general fund to fully operationalize the public pool, which starts usually in June and finishes in early September. Now, if the community were to say, and local elected officials were to say, this doesn't make sense. This is a lot of money spent on a public pool. It's always entertaining to watch newly elected folks say, yeah, we're gonna defund the pool. Doesn't go over very well, right? It doesn't go over very well. So there's certain things that a lot of people in that community are not using that public pool, but yet they realize this is an important part of our community and we're making that investment. There's this reciprocity and this social contract. So the social contract, they call it the social contract theory. And implicit is an agreement among the members of society to cooperate for social benefits, for each contributing their economic resources in order to realize a common interest. So we're pulling these monies together, we're holding elected officials accountable for how they choose to spend those, and the process is transparent and accessible. You can participate in that budgeting process and help determine how do we make the investment of these resources into our public assets and resources. In Montana, we operate with what we call a two-legged stool, which is very comfortable, very effective, creates a lot of frustration. But we have this two-legged stool. That's how we look at our tax revenue, our sources of taxes, where we collect our taxes from. And right now in Montana, we have both income tax and property tax. That's how we fund general state services, through income tax and property tax. What would, if most other states have a three-legged stool and they're balanced, what would be that other leg on the stool? Sales tax, which you folks have that here in the Big Sky area. You have a sales tax. So here, you actually operate with a three-legged stool. You have this diverse balance of tax revenue that you can draw upon. So local governments are funded primarily with property tax, fees, and state disbursements. So state and federal disbursements, but primarily from the state and property tax. So that's how our local taxes. And then the Big Sky area, you have the resort tax or a sales tax. So tax revenue, it's a major source of county government, comes from aid from the state and federal government. So the state, don't want to get too big into the history, but in 2001, prior to 2000, late 90s, a lot of local governments were being funded through a cost share or sharing in revenues from gaming. A lot of money stayed locally on gaming. And I think there is a real challenge that people in both local government and in the state were having about, do we really want to balance our budgets and provide the services on the backs of gaming industry? It creates a perverse incentive. And so that, and as likewise with vehicle registrations and many other things, there was a lot of revenue sharing that was taking place where the county would collect certain fees and taxes. They would keep a portion of that and send the rest of it to Helena for them to use for state operations. So in 2001, we had what was called the Big Bill. This is where they revamped our taxing structure. And so now all those taxes and fees that are collected locally go to the state. And then the state, through a formula, distributes money back to the local governments. And they call that, which is a terrible turn of phrase, they call that the entitlement share. What does that sound like when you say, oh, the state's entitlement share going out to local governments? Yeah, it doesn't sound good. We can't figure out a better way or better words or verbiage there. But so the state entitlement share, that's money that comes back, the state collects, and it comes back to the local governments. And then there's another interesting fact for you. It has a small growth formula to that. So every year there's a little bit of growth that comes into that as we have expansion of our economy and inflation. When the state does really well with income revenues and other tax revenues, the state does really well. They might be collecting at a rate of 5, 6, 7%. That rate of reimbursement back to the local governments does not change. But what we have found is when the economy's in the toilet and the revenues are down significantly, the state likes to share in that reduction. And so they'll reduce the amount of money coming back out to local governments and not honor their commitment in their increase. And they say we all have to share in the hurt, but we're certainly not going to share in the plentiful times. So that's just something. I don't know, is there any legislators in the room? So I can defend you all equally here. Don't see any hands raised. So anyway, so that's the entitlement share. Also oil and gas production, which I don't think there's any oil and gas production in Gallatin or Madison counties. I don't think there's oil. So those oil and gas production companies, there's also revenue that's coming out of that. Then there's PILT. PILT money that comes from the federal government. That's payment in lieu of taxes. So as you think about these counties that have a lot of federal land, that federal land, we're not generating any tax revenue from that. And so the federal government says, well, we realize we have a responsibility to help fund local governments, recognizing that property taxes are an important part of it. We have some counties in the state that have 7% private land. So all their property tax revenue comes from 7% of that land. The rest is federally owned. And so PILT, or payment in lieu of taxes, is really important for those local governments to fund their services because it takes a lot of money to fund those local services. Even though it's a small patch of ground, it takes a lot of money. So the government pitches in. And both those entitlement share and the PILT funds are unencumbered. They are to be invested at the discretion of the elected officials. So they can choose how to distribute those funds within their budget. About 45% of revenue comes from property tax in general. So if you look at the whole state of Montana, for counties and county revenue, about 45% comes from property tax. The remaining comes from the entitlement shares, the PILT, and then other fees that are collected through the operations of local government. So the other thing to remember is there's both dedicated and discretionary revenues. There's dedicated, both ways, dedicated revenue and expenses. There are certain things, for example, if you have, yesterday, Gallatin County passed the bond measure to fund Law and Justice Center. Those funds, because they're voted in by the voters, are earmarked specific for that project. They can't say, well, we're going to take 10% off and we're going to use it over here to redo this bridge or whatever other service that the county has to offer. So there's a lot of the budget that the county has, or both counties or counties across the state have, is they're directly funding a particular service. Either it's statutorily mandated or by voter mandate that this is how those funds will be used. So there's no discretion on how those funds are allocated. It's money in and it goes straight out for that service. So if you have a library mill levy for the county, that money comes in and goes directly and specifically to the library. And they can't use it other ways. Then you have this discretionary revenue, like we said, the PILT or the payment or the entitlement share, that's at the discretion of the local government to decide how they want to invest those funds. I think I have the next slide. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Oh, okay. Montana has this outside reliance on property tax, right? Because we have the two-legged stool, we don't have the diverse revenue streams that are available to us. Like I said, 45% of total revenue comes from property tax, and about 24% comes, compared nationally. So again, we look at our peers around the country, about 24% use of their revenue comes from property tax. The other part is going to come from sales tax and income tax and maybe some other tax sources. So that's where we're a little bit different than our peers around the country. So this heavy dependence makes it challenging for us because we have not a lot of options when it comes time to fund. And at some point, local property owners get a little frustrated and fatigued with continuing to pay for services. And it's not we're not equitably sharing that load. It falls upon the shoulders of the property tax or the property owner. If you think about sales tax, and this is why the legislature has decided to have a resort tax. The impact, and I don't want to take Danny's thunder here, but the impact of these, impact of the visitors in your community. I don't know how many visitor days you get here in Big Sky. If you look at Yellowstone, West Yellowstone, for example, if they're having millions of people come to the park every month, that's millions of people coming through West Yellowstone or Jackson. If you just look at West Yellowstone, that's a big impact that 1,100 people that are permanent residents, property owners in that community, have to fund that impact of those people coming through their community. So by having a resort tax, you can capitalize on some of those assets, on some of those funds, and they can share in that cost. And that's what, in the state of Montana, we're not tapping into that sharing of the cost in our communities, particularly from the outside visitors, but also from people that are coming in and out of your community. So I'm going to show you some data here in a minute, and I wanted to give you an idea of where this information comes from. Right here is, because we are so high tech at the local government center, we still produce stuff on paper. We also have this on our website as this file, and then for a while we had some propeller head guru techie folks took all this data and put it into a database that could provide graphs and really cool interactive tools. We lost the passwords on that program, and we can't get in there to add more data. We're trying to figure that part out of it. Yeah. So this information here is what we collect off the annual financial reports that the cities and counties produce and send to the state. So it's their annual financial report. We take this information so we can calculate and look at what is the current property tax mill value, what's the total number of mills levied. And what we'll do, and the reason why this started way back in the 80s, is there was a trend at the time that the local government center was very new and was getting immersed in this understanding local government. And there was a trend at the time as there was kind of an economic crisis, tax revenues and property tax, there's just some reduction in property values. Anyway, so there's a strain on these budgets. And local government officials were spending their cash carryover. They're spending their savings account at a high rate. But just think about that in this environment. If you spend your cash reserves down, how easy is it to replenish those? It's not real easy. It takes a long time to build those cash reserves up. And so if you spend them down quickly, that's going to create some real problems. And so they're noticing this trend, and so they started gathering this data and informing local governments that you have a trend here that is not sustainable and that you need to figure out a way to reverse that. So that was one of the reasons why we started collecting this information. So from that, I'm going to talk about total funds appropriated for counties, and included in that is all of this, that big long list. These are the things that are included when we calculate total funds appropriated. There's general funds appropriated, but then there's total funds. It includes everything. So library fund, extension fund, airport, hospital, all those special districts and all those additional tax districts that are collected beyond just the straight property tax. but that's property tax on top of for specific purposes. Is that making sense? Okay, I know it's 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, so bear with me. Oh, big chart, lots of numbers. So at the top of this chart, what I have is, it was easy for me to come up with 2018, so I apologize they're not, but it's all general. So all counties of Montana, you can see in 2014 and 2018, it averages out to about $820 per person, or $828 for 2018. So that was an increase in those 5 years of about 14% statewide. Now, looking at Gallatin County, Madison County, and I threw in Missoula County because they're a similar county to what Gallatin County would be a peer. Similar population, similar, has a university growth challenges that Gallatin County has. So you can kind of see how the counties are comparing here. So just looking at the population, total funds appropriated, and the per capita appropriation, you can see Gallatin County's moved from 502 per person per capita for property tax to 673. Madison County has actually gone down, mostly because their population has increased. And you can see that compared to Missoula County. You can see the total amount of money that's been appropriated. So Missoula County, and this is what we're hearing a lot. We're working with Missoula County pretty closely right now on several big issues. And this frustration from their citizens around this property tax fatigue. And they're needing to be very strategic right now about what they ask of their taxpayers. They have a lot of requests to do things as a local government, but how they fund that is becoming a bigger challenge. They can't keep going back to the voters because they're saying, look, we're paying plenty. Can we figure out another way to provide that service? Any questions on this chart? If you've got any questions, Justine's happy to answer them for you. All right. So countywide services, how are we doing on time? I think we're doing close here. Countywide services, those services utilized, as I said, by a broad spectrum of, so as you think about, when you look at the services, what service is going to provide a blanket support across the county? Those are going to be the countywide services. And then there's services that are going to be specific, what sometimes they'll call it special districts or municipal services. Gallatin Gateway, Big Sky, Four Corners. These are areas that are unincorporated. The county is not designed to be able to address the issues and needs that are presented in highly dense populations. They're more designed and equipped to deal with more rural setting. So it becomes a challenge when there's these highly dense, there's different issues and concerns and needs that are expressed in these areas like Big Sky and Four Corners and Gallatin Gateway. And so to provide those services, they start thinking about, well, if we use generally collected funds to deal with a very specific issue in Gallatin Gateway, that's not necessarily fair to all the taxpayers because there's an outsized use and consumption of those resources. So that creates a motivation to develop a special district. So instead of everyone paying for something that's going on in a very localized spot, we'll say, let's create a district that can collect taxes to address that specific immediate issue. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, you can nod anyway and I'll go on. All right. So there, I just want to make that distinction too. There's that broad investment. So roads are going to be addressing the entire community, but there might be something very specific. Fire district, fire services could be very different in an area like Big Sky versus a rural section of Gallatin County or Madison County. Don't want to leave you guys out of the fun there. So in countywide services, often funded right out of the general fund. Dedicated services are funded by specific revenue. Sometimes the county can backfill. There might be a greater need for some of those dedicated sources of funding or services to provide. A greater need might exist and they may backfill with some of that discretionary funds. And then you have the exclusively dedicated revenue. So just looking at schools take up a tremendous amount. We haven't mentioned that, but schools take up a tremendous amount of funding. particularly with the school equalization that takes place, a constitutional mandate we have to make sure that everyone gets equal access to education. And so we had to create a taxation process that allowed that to happen. 41% special purpose levies and about 4% comes from the general fund. So there's not a lot of discretionary funds found in this, in the budgets of our local governments. And I think that's it for me, because I saw the hook coming. They boot me off. If you're interested, I have copies of these, and you can grab them and take a look at how you might compare with other areas around the state.
Perfect.
There's
I'll
your
grab the
clicker.
clicker and the mic.
Want one?
Oh,